Today, we're back with another sci-fi tunnel animation that's targeted mostly towards beginners. However, we will be going through quite a few tips and tricks to make it seem like you're running through this particular tunnel forever. So with that, let's actually go ahead and begin this tutorial. In our default scene, we're going to be using geometry nodes, so we'll bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and then change this from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Then we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, after which we'll zoom in, select the group input and tap X to delete it. Now the main idea is we're going to be creating every single part of the tunnel separately and joining them together using a join geometry node. So we can start off by pressing Shift A, searching for the join geometry and plugging that in. Every single section that we create will join in right over here. So the way we're going to do this is by pressing Shift A and searching for a curve line. Now, why we're using a curved line is so that we can get 2 points to be exactly where we want. Let's plug this in right over here and then go ahead and change the actual start and end positions of this curved line. Since we want 2 points, we need one to be present on this side over here and one to be present on this side over here. That's the x-axis. So we're going to type a start value of maybe something like minus 0.2 on the x, and even the end can be maybe 0.2 on the x, but we don't want it to go up on the z, so let's change this down to 0. So now we should have 2 points present, one right here and one right there. And in fact, maybe for this tutorial, I'll go with a value of minus 0.5 and a value of plus 0.5. So once we have that set, we can go ahead and instance 2 more lines on these points. So right now, we can go ahead and just instance lines on the points and we'd get lines that go forward like this. On those, we can instance whatever tiles we want. So let's go ahead and press Shift A and search for an instance on points node. Now when we plug that in, we need to give some sort of an instance that's going to be added to every single point. Because we are using a curved line, there's just going to be 1 point here and 1 point there. Because we're using the instance on points, on those points, we'll be adding in something else. So let's search for a curved line, or you can just select this one and press Shift D to duplicate it. Now we can plug that into the instance, and on every single point, we'd get these particular lines. However, we don't want the line to be in the X orientation anymore. So we'll change this to a value of 0 on the X, and even for the end, we'll change that to 0. And for the Y, we'll make it something really large. Let's go with a value of 10 meters. So now you get the 2 different lines on which we're going to instance whatever tiles we want. So right now, if we actually look at this curved line, there's 1 point here and 1 point here. There are no points in between. So to create points in between, we're going to search for a resample curve node and plug that in right here. Let's increase the count to 11. And then on these newly created points, we're going to instance some tiles. So let's search for another instance on points node and plug that in after the resample curve. And for the instance, we're going to simply use maybe a grid node this time, because the grid node is essentially like a plane or a tile. Let's plug that in, and this is exactly what we get, which is what I wanted. However, there are a few more things that I need to do. Right now, if we were to just switch off overlays, it would look like a single plane when we go into rendered view, because there's absolutely no gap between these tiles. So you can't actually tell that they are tiles that we created. So to get the tile effect, what we're going to do is decrease the size of each of these grids. So let's search for a scale elements node, or instead of a scale elements node, you could just change the size over here to be 0.95 meters instead of 1 meter. And that way we get these gaps between the tiles, and even in rendered mode, you should be able to see that they are individual tiles. So that's how we create the tiles for our base of the tunnel. Now let's go ahead and reorganize this to make it look a little better. We can switch on the snapping by pressing this button and then just reorganize these a little bit so that it's much easier when we come back to this later on. However, since all of these create these tiles, we can select all of them and press Ctrl J to create a frame around these nodes. We'll go to the node tab over here and label the frame to be something like floor tiles. Now, once we're done with that, we can go ahead and create the next section. So maybe now what we'll do is create two rings or at least two lines that go around these floor tiles. So let's go ahead and press Shift A and search for another curved line. We'll use the exact same principle that we just learned, where we can create a line to get 2 points, one present on this side, one present on that side, and instance some lines onto that. So let's go ahead and change the x to a value of maybe -1 this time, and the end can be 0 on the z and +1 on the x. To see where these are, we can just plug this into the join geometry, and then you can see that we have the line present right over here. We need it to be a little longer, so let's go ahead and change this from -1 to maybe something like -1.25. So that way it comes a bit longer over there. So we'll have to change the plus as well to 1.25, and that looks great. Now on these 2 points, we'll go ahead and instance two more curves. So let's search for an instance on points node, and then also search for another curve line or press Shift D on this line. And if you want to just reset the node, you can actually just press the backspace with it selected and it becomes reset to the default. Now the default has a z value of 1. We don't want that, so we'll change that to 0, and we'll just change the end y to maybe something like 11 meters, and we'll go ahead and plug that into the instance for the instance on points. Now the reason why we're doing 11 meters is because we want this to seamlessly fit with the next instance of the entire object that we create. But because the original line was 10 meters and every single tile has 0.5 meters this side and 0.5 meters that side, it's going to perfectly loop when this becomes 11 meters. So that's why we're creating it just like that. There will be 0.5 left over on this side and there's 0.5 extra on this side, so it'll perfectly fit in like a puzzle piece. However, let's now convert these from just curves to actual mesh, because right now if we were to go into our rendered view and switch off overlays, you see you can't see the two new lines that you created. So in order to be able to see it, we're going to search for a curve to mesh node and plug that in after the instance on points. Now for the profile curve, we'll use a curve circle, and then we're going to change the actual parameters of the curve circle. So let's plug that in over here and just reduce the radius down to maybe something like 0.1. And if you think that's still too fat, you can always reduce it to maybe 0.05. Apart from that, we don't need this high of a resolution. So to make things much faster when we render, we'll reduce the resolution down to 16. Now that we have that created, we can go ahead and create a base floor that will act as the floor for our entire tunnel. So let's first reorganize these by again selecting these, Ctrl J to create a frame. We'll label the frame as maybe side rails, and then we'll go ahead and just bring a lot of these nodes a bit closer so that everything looks much more organized and easier to understand and digest. Now that we have that created, let's go ahead and create the base floor. So press Shift A, search for a grid node, and simply plug that into the join geometry. Now if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, you can just press Alt, right click, and just drag to the join geometry and the connection will be made. Now you can see there are a few issues with the plane that we just created. Firstly, it's perfectly in line with the tiles. We don't want that. We want it to be below the tiles. So what we're going to do is search for a set position node and plug that in after the grid node. Then we'll just decrease the z value to something like -0.1, and that should bring it down to the correct amount. Then we want to actually increase the size so that we can cover the entire distance. So to increase the size, we're going to go ahead and increase it on the y to a value of 11 meters, and on the x as well, we'll increase it to maybe something like 4 meters. Now you can see even though we have 4 meters over here, it's clearly not actually aligning with the setup that we created. So in our set position node, we're going to have to offset it on the y till it matches up. So the offset on the y that I'll go with is going to be a value of 5 meters. Now you could do 5.5 as well. It'll always perfectly fit in just like a puzzle piece. However, for now I'll go with 5 meters, and this is good enough for the floor. Now at the edge of the floor, I want 2 more rails, but before I create those rails, let's go ahead and create a frame for this. So Ctrl J, rename this to maybe floor, and then go ahead and start with the edge rails. To create the edge rails, we'll press Shift A, search for another curved line, or what you can do is take these side rails, select all of the nodes, and press Shift D to create a duplicate. Then we can rename this from side rails to edge rails, and we can go ahead and simply plug this output right into the joint geometry once again. Now we need to get these to move even more towards the edges. So let's go and change this from a value of maybe minus 1.25 to a value of minus 1.5 and maybe even more. So let's go with minus 2 and just see what distance suits your needs. So maybe a value of minus 2 works great. So the plus should be plus 2 as well, and that should be good enough. Now that we have the edge rails, we can go ahead and create the actual outer walls, which is going to act as the border for our tunnel. So to create that, we're going to search for a curve line, and we're going to simply plug that into our joint geometry. Again, with the node wrangler enabled, Alt right click, drag it there, joins it in much faster. Now, we want the length of this to be the entire 11 meters. So we'll change the Z value to 0 and have this end at a value of 11 on the Y axis. Now we need to convert this to an actual circle or a tunnel. So to convert it into a tunnel, we'll search for a curve to mesh node, plug that in right here. And for the profile curve, we'll use another curve circle. Now remember, the curve circle is going to be really small, so we can increase that by playing around with the radius. We want the radius to just be the size of this. So once we're happy with that size, we can go ahead and actually convert these into tiles instead of having one solid loop. To convert them into tiles, what we can do is expand this overlays option and switch on wireframe so that we can actually see the wireframes that are creating this entire object. Now, these are what the wireframes look like. We don't have actual edge loops over here along the cylinder. So we need to create more edge loops along this edge. And in order to do that, we can just resample this initial curve line. So let's press Shift A and search for a resample curve node and plug that in right here. And now we can start increasing the count until it becomes roughly square. So let's press 7 on our numpad to go into the top view, or you can go to View and then choose Viewpoint Top to get this top view. Then you can go ahead and play around with this count until they look approximately square-ish. So maybe I'm gonna have to go with a value of 25 maybe, or if you want, I think a value of 28 will also be fine. For now, I'll just go with a value of 30. Now that we have that created, we want each of these to become actual tiles instead of being a solid loop. So to convert these to tiles, we're going to have to first split the edges because they are all one single face right now, or at least one single connected object right now. So let's search for a split faces node or split edges node and plug that in right here. And now we have the individual faces not connected to each other. So now in order to make each of them smaller, we're going to search for a scale elements node, plug that in right here, and it's already set to face, and we're going to just decrease the scale by a little bit. So maybe 0.95 is good enough. Now in order to give these some amount of thickness, we're going to have to extrude them. So let's press Shift A, search for an extrude mesh node, and we're going to have to extrude it inward so that we don't have to get these empty sockets created. So instead of an offset scale on the positive axis, we're just going to reduce it, and make it negative. Now just a small value, maybe minus 0.01 is good enough, or a value of maybe minus 0.05 will be more than enough. If we go too far, we're just going to be engulfing the entire cylinder that we created here. So make sure that you don't go too much and have it at a size that suits your needs. In fact, maybe I'll just bring these cylinders in a bit by making this value minus 1.95 instead of minus 0.2, and even over here minus or plus 1.95, and that should just bring them in a little bit more. Then once you're happy with that, over here in the extrude mesh, you see what happens is the shading is set to smooth, So we get these really weird shading occurring. So we don't want that type of shading. So I'll search for a set shade smooth node. And after searching for the set shade smooth, I'm just going to uncheck the shade smooth button. So that way it becomes flat, which is exactly what I wanted. Now I don't need to see this overlay wire anymore. So let's go ahead and switch off wireframe, and that looks good enough. Now let's go ahead and select all of these, press Ctrl J and label this frame as wall tiles. Now that we're done with the wall tiles as well, we have to create the actual ring lights. And maybe apart from the ring lights, I don't want this to just be a perfect semicircle. I want this floor to be towards the base. So what I'm going to do is, instead of having this be just present from the center, I'll lift this up. To lift it up, I'll maybe move it on the y-axis by maybe 0.5 units, and even the end should be moved up by 0.5 units. And you can see how we move the entire thing up. Let's move it up a little bit more. Let's go with 0.75 and a value of 0.75 here as well. Now that we have that lifted up, obviously we need to increase this radius as well. So let's just increase the radius a little bit more, and that should be fine. If you feel like the number of tiles are changed such that they are no longer square, you can go ahead and play around with this particular count on the resample curve. So that's the best part about using geometry nodes and procedural modeling, is that if you want to make changes, you can make changes at any point of time, and it's very easy to incorporate those changes. So now I think a value of 27 is making it more or less square. Value of 28 might work the best. So that's good enough. Now that we have that created, let's go ahead and create the ring lights. So for the ring lights, let's go ahead and duplicate this particular edge rails, or instead we can just create it by ourselves once again. So let's duplicate the wall tiles. Actually, let's select these, press Shift D to duplicate them, then again select this last button, Alt and right click all the way to the join geometry, and then once you have that selected into the join geometry, you can rename this from wall tiles to maybe ring lights. Now that we have ring lights selected, we have to remove all of the things that we don't need. So we don't need the curved mesh, any of these. So let's just select them and press Ctrl X to remove them with the connection still intact. Now let's look at how we want to resample the curve. We don't want to resample it to 28. We just want a few rims to be present. Maybe 4 rims is going to be good enough. So we'll resample it to just a value of 4. Then we actually need these to become rings. So let's search for an instance on points node, and for the actual instance we're going to use a curved circle. So let's search for the curved circle and plug that in to the instance socket of the instance on points. Now we can see that they're clearly rotated incorrectly, and that's a very simple fix. We just have to rotate them about the x-axis by 90 degrees. So let's just do that, and now they're rotated correctly. We have to change the radius as well, such that they perfectly fit within the actual outer ring. And of course, they can be inside this particular inner ring or outside this particular edge line. It doesn't matter. So for now, let's make the radius as something like maybe 2 itself. And we have to increase the actual resolution, because right now it's fairly flat. I want it to be nice, smooth, and round. So I'll increase the resolution to 128, and that makes it much smoother. Now let's go ahead and convert this into real geometry so that even if we switch off overlays, they will be seen. So for that, we're going to use the same technique that we've done before, which is searching for a curve to mesh node and simply using a curved circle as the profile curve. So let's search for a curved circle, plug that into the curve to mesh, and that looks perfectly all right. Now that we have that created, we need to change this radius down till we get something that suits our needs. Let's go with a radius of maybe 0.05 itself, and that should be good enough. Apart from that, if you want to reduce the resolution, you can reduce the resolution. I'll keep it at 32 itself, or I'll reduce it to 16 just to make our renders a bit faster. Now that we have that selected, we are technically done with creating everything. However, you will realize that there's one issue. If we were to duplicate this over, there will be an overlap for this particular edge light that we created, or ring light that we created, and this ring light. And it won't fit in like a puzzle piece. these two will be overlapping. So in order to prevent this issue, we want to delete either this ring or that ring. And that's very simple. Instead of deleting the ring, for this instance on points, you can use the selection, and we'll select everything except for the first ring. So every ring has an index value, and that starts from 0, then 1, 2, and 3. So we can get the index values by just searching for an index node, and we can compare the indices with the values that we want to remove. So if it's not 0, only then should the curved circle be implemented. So let's search for a compare node, and we want to say if this index is not 0. So we say not equal to 0. Now remember, indices are green dots, which means they're integers. So we change this from float to integer, and now we can just say not equal to 0. So let's plug this index. If the index is not equal to 0, only then should this work. So let's plug this result into the selection, and that works perfectly all right. Now that we have that created, you'll see that this particular edge ring disappears, and we can go ahead and start off instancing this so that we create a seamless loop. So let's just select this, press Alt D to create a linked duplicate or an instance of this entire object, and then just press G, Y followed by 11 so that it fits in like a perfect puzzle piece. Then to repeat that action, we can just press Shift R, and it'll just repeat that as many times as you want so that we don't get the absolute edge and it remains as a perfectly seamless loop. However, maybe 9 instances a bit too much, so I'll make it 6 instances or 7 instances for now. Then we can go ahead and start with the actual materials. So let's go to our material properties, rename this to maybe the first thing that we created, which were the floor tiles, and then start off with actually assigning these materials to every single one of these sections that we created. So for the floor tiles, let's press Shift A, search for a set material, plug that in right here, and then we'll just press Shift D and duplicate it all the way down the entire chain. So once we have all of those selected, we can go ahead and start playing around with the actual materials. And remember, keep these in order so that we don't get mixed up later on. Now for the floor tiles, let's select floor tile over here. Then the next is the side rails. So let's press this plus button, create a new material, call it side rails, and then go ahead and select that over here. Then again, over here, this is coming in from the floor. So press this plus button, new material, call it floor, and select that over here. Then this one is coming in from edge rails. So let's press this plus button, new material, call it edge rails, and then select it over here. Then the last or the second last is coming from the wall tiles. So plus button, new, call it wall tiles, and then select it over there. Also remember, I am using the same names, but you don't have to. You can rename these to whatever you want. It'll work just as well. Lastly, we have ring lights. So let's go ahead and press this plus button, new button, call it ring lights, and then go ahead and select that right over here. Now that we have all of those selected and created, we can go ahead and actually switch over to our viewport shading of render so that we can see the changes that we're making. So let's press this button, switch off overlays, then change this from the geometry node editor to the shader editor, then go to the world properties, change the background color all the way to black. Let's select the default light and delete it. And then with the default cube selected, let's go to our material properties and start off with the ring lights. Now the ring lights have to be emissive, and in order for these emissions to actually light up the scene, we're gonna have to switch on screen space refractions or reflections. So let's go to our render properties, switch on screen space reflections, and we'll switch on bloom as well. Now let's delete the principal BSDF for the ring lights, press Shift A and search for maybe an emission node and plug that into the surface of the material output. Now you can see that we have some sort of lights present in our scene. Let's increase the strength up to something like 5. And for the color, I want this left hand side to be one color and the right hand side to be another color. For that, we have to search for the gradient texture and plug that into the emission socket. And then we have to actually change the vector so that we can move this around, because right now the gradient starts from this left. I want the gradient to be in the center. So let's press Ctrl T with the node wrangler enabled to get the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Alternatively, you can press Shift A, search for these nodes separately and add them in. Then you can switch it over from generated to object, and now the gradient is there perfectly at the center. However, I'm going to change the scale down to something like 0.2 just so that it's a smoother gradient, and then I'll move it back just like that so that we get a better gradient. Now I need to control the colors of the gradient. So let's move this to the side, press Shift A and search for a color ramp node, plug that in right here, and maybe all of the black colors can be this sort of a blue, and maybe the whitest portions can be maybe this sort of an orange. Now, of course, you can see that we're seeing the blue, we're not seeing the orange. So let's play around with this X location a bit more till we get it so that we have both the blue as well as the orange. Now, since we're doing this at an emission value of 5, they're actually very bright. So instead of having the default filmic applied, we'll go all the way down to our color management and change this from filmic to AGX. So that way we'll just get more accurate representations of our colors, and I think that looks much better. Maybe I'll change this to 0.5 and that looks great. Now that we have this created, let's go ahead and start with the rest of the objects in our scene. Let's first go to our material properties and choose this time the floor tiles. Now for the floor tiles, I just want to increase the metallic all the way to 1, keep the roughness at maybe something like 0.4, and that's all for my floor tiles. Then I'll select the side rails. For the side rails, I want them to be emissive, but the inner side rails, I want them to be the opposite of whatever this color is. So let's delete the principled BSDF, search for another gradient texture, plug that into the surface, and of course before plugging it into the surface you actually need a shader. The shader is going to be an emission shader. Plug that in right there. For the selection of the colors, you can use a color ramp node, plug that in right here, and then again to get more control, press Ctrl T, switch this over to object, and now we have to play around with this to get the correct gradient. So let's actually bring this in just like that and see what movement we have to do to get one side to be colored and the other side to not be colored. So just like that, at a value of something like this, we are getting this side lit as white and this side as black. So let's change this to maybe 0.5. Let's just increase the scale of the gradient so that it's a sharper transition. And now this does not really matter because we've increased the scale over here. It's a sharp transition somewhere in the middle. Let's go ahead and just bring these in either way and change the colors appropriately. So what should the colors be? Since we want this side to be orange, we're going to take this white one and change it to that same orange color just like that. Then this side has to be the blue. So let's select this black, change it to the blue color, and that should work just as much. However, let's increase the emission strength to something like 5, and that looks great. Now we want to do the exact same thing for the outer edge rails. So let's delete the principled BSDF, search for an emission shader, plug that into the material output. Again, for the color, we're going to use a gradient texture. We're going to plug that in through a color ramp. So let's search for the color ramp, plug that in right here. And now press Ctrl T with the node wrangler enabled, get the texture coordinates and change it to object. And now we'll just go ahead and increase this scale from 1 to something really high, 50, because we don't need any transition. We just need this to be blue and this to be white, or this to actually be orange. So let's go ahead and change this to that same orange color. And in case you're not using standard colors just like this, what you could do is select the originals that you had, whatever it was, whether it's the ring lights or anything. Just hover over this color and press Ctrl C to copy it. Then again on your edge rails, you can go over to whichever one you wanted. So this has to be the orange. So let's just hover over this and press Ctrl V, and the orange gets selected just like that. So that's just one way you could copy colors in case you don't know the values. If you want other methods of copying the colors, you can go to the hex value and just press Ctrl C and then paste that into the hex value of whatever area you want to paste the color. Let's increase the strength to 5 over here as well, and that looks perfectly all right. If you want to make any changes to the positions of these, you can, and that's really up to you, but I'll leave it as is for now. Then let's go ahead and start off with the floor. So for the floor, I want it to be metallic just like before, but I want it to be much darker. So let's just reduce this towards the black. Then for the roughness, I'm going to use a noise texture, and I'm going to use a color ramp so that I get control over the noise texture. And then I can plug the color into the factor of the color ramp and plug this color into the roughness of the principled BSDF. Now that we have that created, you should be able to see some sort of variation in the amount of reflections occurring in the different parts of this particular floor. Now make sure that you don't move your camera a bit too much and just zoom in, and you can see that there are variations, but the variations are over too large of a scale. So let's just increase that scale, and now you can see we get so much more variation. Then I'll increase the detail all the way to 15, and I'll start increasing the roughness. But to make this even more contrasty, I'll just bring this black in, and I'll bring the white in as well. But I don't want the white to be a value of white, or in other words, completely non-reflective. So I'll just select this, go to the RGB or the HSV, and I'll change the value from 1 to maybe a value of 0.7. So that way it will be a little bit reflective, at least at any point of this particular floor. So that looks perfectly all right. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for the other objects present in the scene, such as the wall tiles. So let's select the wall tiles. Let's make this completely metallic. Again, if you keep this as white, everything becomes very bright. If that's what you're going for, good, you can keep it just as is. But I'm going to reduce this to make it a bit darker. Then I'll search for another noise texture, plug that into the roughness socket just like that. Again, pass it through a color ramp for better control, and then just bring the values in one by one. So this comes in, this goes right over there. Now I'm going to change this from a value of 1 to maybe a value of 0.7. And then again, for the scale, let's just increase the scale a bit, maybe increase the detail, increase the roughness, and you can play around with this until you get exactly what you think suits your scene. So I'm just going to leave it like this for now, but I might change it just before hitting the render button. Now that you're done with that, you can start off with the actual scene setup or your camera setup. So let's select the camera, press Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation, followed by RX90 to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. Then we can press 0 to go into our camera view, and we'll press GZ to just lift it up until we have it at a position that suits your requirements. So I think something like this is good enough. Let's go to our camera properties over here, change the focal length down to maybe 25 meters. And for the viewport display, I'm going to expand it and increase passpower 2 all the way to 1. Now that I have that selected and working fine, I can go ahead and set all of my animation and render defaults. Let's go to my output properties, change this resolution to 200 so that it's a 4K animation. Frame rate can be 60 frames per second. End frame, I'm going to choose 300. It'll become a 5-second long loop. And then my output folder can be wherever you want it to be. File format FFmpeg video. Encoding, I'm going to change from Matroska to MPEG-4, and output quality as perceptually lossless. Then I'll expand the timeline by a little bit, and with the actual camera selected, I'll tap I and I'll choose location and rotation. Then I'll go ahead and move over to the last frame, which is frame 300, and I'll press G, Y, followed by the length of the tunnel, which is 11 meters, and then I'll tap I, location and rotation. Then down here, I'll press T and I'll choose linear. And then if you just play the animation, you should get a smooth loop all the way through. Remember, right now, if you were to switch on overlays, you can see that the frame rate is going to be very slow, or at least it is on my laptop. So I'm going to change from play every frame to frame dropping, and that way you'll get a realistic idea of how fast you're moving through the actual tunnel. If this is everything that you want, well and good, but you'll see there's one little issue. That is towards the end, when you flip back to frame 1, there's going to be a little bit of a discontinuity towards that end. Now you can change that in many ways. One method is just adding in even more of these instances, but the method that I'm going to use today is I'm going to search for a mesh cube, and I'll just scale the cube up so that it covers this entire region. So just press S, GZ a little bit, and that way everything's covered. Now I'll press GY and I'll move it just towards the end, somewhere like that. And now, instead of keeping it as just this cube, I'll add in a new material to it. I'll delete the principled BSDF and I'll search for a principled volume. Of course, you could use other objects or other nodes like the volume scatter, but for today I'll use the principled volume and I'll plug the volume into the volume. Now I'll just change this color all the way to white, and then by playing around with the density, you should be able to get a situation where instead of these just popping up, they just fade into black. So that is the exact effect. Now between frame 300 and frame 0, you shouldn't see a difference. But you still see a difference because the cube is staying stationary. We need the cube to move along with the camera. So with the cube selected, control click the camera in the actual outliner over here, and then with your cursor in the 3D viewport, press Ctrl P and choose Set Parent to Object. So now the cube is moving along with the camera. So if you go to frame 300 and frame 0, you should see absolutely no difference. And in case you see some difference, just select that last cube that you added in and either scale it up on the y-axis or play around with these density values. So whenever you're done playing around with them, you should be able to get a seamless loop, and both the front and end of the animation, or the first frame and last frame, should look the exact same. So since it's looking the exact same, you know you have a perfectly looping animation, and that is perfect for that right now. Now the next thing that I want to go through in this video, which might actually make this video a lot longer than usual, but I think it's a fun thing to know, is actually how to add in some type of noise to the camera to make it seem like you're actually running through this tunnel forever. So let's go ahead and switch this from the timeline to the graph editor and make sure you have the camera selected. Then with all of these keyframes that you now have, you can expand this down here, and all you have to do is just add in some sort of noise. You can add it in for the location as well as the rotation, or just the location, or just the rotation. It's really up to you. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select all of them, and then in my side panel, I have to go to the actual modifier panel. To get the modifier panel, make sure that you have only these keyframes selected. So just select all of them by Shift and Select, and you should get all of these panels present over here. If this side panel is not open itself, you can tap N to bring it out. Then go to the modifiers and add in maybe a noise modifier. Now with this noise modifier, you can go ahead and just increase the scale so that it's not too much, and play around with the strengths as well. So I'm going to make the strength as 0.1 and a scale of maybe 15 on each of them. Then just play around with the offset. So change the offset and the phase so that it's not the same on all of the different axes. So right now that worked for the X rotation. Now let's go ahead and do the Y rotation. So let's change the scale, maybe something like 15, strength, make it down to something like 0.1, play around with the offset here and the offset there. Then do the same for the Z. So let's reduce the scale, maybe something like 0.1. The scale should be higher. Let's go with a value of 15 or 16. Let's change the strength down to 0.1, change the offset, change the phase. So now when you play it, you should get some sort of a running kind of animation. You can play around with the strengths as well as the locations just to make this a lot smoother. You could make it slower. It's really up to you, but that is how you can get this sort of a running effect. You can do the exact same things for the locations as well. So just make sure that you play around with these so that it's not too strong or anything like that. It should be just really, really subtle. In my case, while showing it, yes, it is way too much, but you should be able to redo it to make it much more subtle. So that's actually all there is to creating this sort of a looping animation. Once you're happy with the way everything looks, you can go ahead and press Render Animation. I really hope that was an interesting tutorial and you learned something from it. I know it probably is longer than most tutorials on my channel, but it is necessary to go through 1 or 2 long tutorials so that even beginners can follow along. I hope the pace of this tutorial was slower than most of my other tutorials, and everybody, including absolute beginners, were able to catch every single step. If at all you have any questions, queries, or comments, let me know down below, and I'll try to answer all of them for as long as I possibly can. I'm trying to post videos every single day, so until my next video comes out, hopefully tomorrow, you can check out all the other videos on my channel because I have over 300 videos and tutorials just waiting for you to discover them. Until the next one comes out, thank you so much for watching, keep creating, and don't forget to stay creative.